You are walking across an open plain. It is roughly 12,000 years ago. You have been tracking a herd of wild horses for 2 days. Your grandfather tracked these same horses. His grandfather tracked mammoths on this same ground. But the mammoths are gone now. Have been for a generation. The giant ground sloths are gone. The woolly rhinoceros is gone. The horses your group depends on are smaller than they used to be, thinner, harder to find. The landscape that fed your ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years is quietly, irreversibly emptying. You don't have a word for extinction, but you feel what it means every morning when the hunt comes back with less than it did the year before. Most people frame this story as a choice. Ancient humans at some point decided to eat less meat, became more plant-based, evolved toward a gentler relationship with the animals around them. The reality is almost the precise opposite. The reduction of meat in ancient human diets was not a choice. It was a catastrophe. And what happened to the human body in the aftermath of that catastrophe is still unfolding inside you, right now. For the first 2 million years of human existence, meat was the nutritional foundation everything else was built around. Not because ancient humans preferred it aesthetically, because the caloric and nutritional density of large animal flesh, the fat, the organs, the marrow, allowed a relatively small group of people to sustain themselves on relatively modest amounts of foraging effort. A single large animal kill could feed a group of 30 people for days. The energy return on a successful hunt was enormous compared to the labor-intensive, weather-dependent, seasonally unreliable work of plant food collection. This is not speculation. Stable carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of ancient human bones, the same technique that measures dietary protein sources preserved in bone collagen, shows that for most of human prehistory, large animal protein contributed substantially and consistently to the diet of populations across every continent where large animals existed. The human body co-evolved with that diet. Stomach acid pH in humans is significantly more acidic than in most omnivores, closer to the acidity of dedicated scavengers and carnivores. A feature that makes biological sense only if the diet historically included substantial amounts of animal protein and fat, including meat that was not always fresh. The human small intestine is longer relative to body size than would be expected for a primarily plant-based diet, optimized for extracting nutrients from animal foods. The liver's capacity for processing fat-soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, K2, is calibrated for a diet in which those vitamins arrive in concentrated form through animal organs. The body built by 2 million years of eating large animals is the body you're living in right now. And what happened to that body when the large animals disappeared is one of the most consequential and least discussed transitions in human history. Between roughly 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, something happened on every continent that humans had reached. The megafauna died. Not gradually, through the slow pressure of climate change alone. In a pattern that tracks, continent by continent, with the arrival of human hunters, suddenly, terminally, and at a speed that the fossil record makes unmistakable. In Australia, megafauna extinctions cluster around 46,000 years ago, within a few thousand years of the first confirmed human presence. In the Americas, they cluster around 13,000 years ago, shortly after humans crossed the land bridge from Siberia. In Europe and Asia, the pattern is more complex. Humans had been present longer, and the megafauna had more time to develop behavioral wariness. But the trajectory was the same. Paleontologist Paul Martin spent decades building the case for what he called the overkill hypothesis. The argument that human hunters, moving into ecosystems that had never encountered a predator that hunted cooperatively, used fire, and planned across time, were so catastrophically effective that they drove the largest animals on every continent to extinction within a few thousand years of arrival. The megafauna of the Americas, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American horses, camels, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, had spent millions of years evolving in an environment without human hunters. They had no inherited fear of the two-legged animal that appeared at the end of the last ice age carrying spears and fire. They were, in the bluntest possible terms, easy. Within 2,000 years of human arrival in the Americas, 35 genera of large mammals were gone. Ancient humans did not stop eating meat. They ate it until there was almost nothing left to eat. The consequences arrived in a wave that reshaped everything. As large prey became scarce, human groups faced a nutritional gap that had never existed before in their species' history. The caloric foundation that had supported 2 million years of population growth was collapsing, and the responses ancient humans developed to fill that gap permanently altered the trajectory of human civilization. The first response was intensification, hunting smaller animals harder, diversifying into fish, shellfish, birds, and small mammals that had previously been supplementary rather than primary food sources. The archaeological record shows this transition clearly. Middens, ancient refuse piles, that had been dominated by the bones of large mammals begin filling with fish bones, bird bones, shellfish, and the remains of animals a fraction of the size of what came before. The caloric math was brutal. It took far more hunting effort to get the same caloric return from small animals that a single large kill had previously provided. Groups were working harder for less. The second response was plant intensification, collecting, processing, and eventually deliberately cultivating plant foods at a scale that had never been necessary before. The seeds and tubers and grasses that had always been supplementary began moving toward the center of the diet. Not because they were nutritionally superior, but because the animals that had anchored the diet were gone. This is where the agricultural revolution actually begins. Not with a sudden human insight about the potential of farming, with a nutritional emergency that left populations with no alternative but to figure out how to grow what they could no longer reliably hunt. And here is what that transition cost. The skeletal record of the agricultural transition is, by every biological metric, a record of decline. Average height dropped by 4 to 6 inches in many populations within a few generations of the shift to grain-based agriculture, the direct signature of reduced protein quality and quantity in the diet. Dental enamel hypoplasia, the visible record of childhood nutritional stress written into tooth structure, became dramatically more common. Evidence of iron deficiency anemia, visible in characteristic pitting of the eye sockets called cribera orbitalia, appears in agricultural populations at rates that dwarf anything seen in hunter-gatherer remains. Tuberculosis, which requires the close contact conditions of dense, settled populations and is severely worsened by nutritional deficiency, explodes in the archaeological record coinciding with agricultural settlement. Childhood mortality rates increased. Average lifespan, measured from skeletal aging, declined. The populations that shifted to grain-based agriculture because the megafauna were gone were not thriving on their new diet. They were surviving it, producing more children than hunter-gatherer populations, which is why agriculture spread despite its health costs, but producing them in bodies that were measurably less robust than the bodies their ancestors had built on 2 million years of eating large animals. Paleoanthropologist Clark Spencer Larson, whose decades of skeletal analysis documented this transition in precise detail, described it as one of the most significant deteriorations in human health in the entire archaeological record. Not a gradual drift, a collapse written in bone. The body did not adapt quickly. It still has not fully adapted. The agricultural transition happened roughly 10,000 years ago, the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. The human genome has made some adjustments. Populations with long agricultural histories show higher copy numbers of the amylase gene, which codes for the enzyme that breaks down starch, a direct evolutionary response to grain-heavy diets. Some populations developed lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, as domesticated animals became a partial substitute for the nutrients previously obtained from wild game. But these are patches, adjustments on the margins of a genome still fundamentally calibrated for the diet that built it. The chronic disease patterns that define modern health in grain-dependent societies, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, the inflammatory conditions that barely appear in hunter-gatherer skeletal remains, are not coincidences. They are the signature of a body running on fuel it was never designed for, in quantities and forms that have no precedent in its evolutionary history. When doctors and nutritionists argue today about optimal human diet, about protein, about carbohydrates, about saturated fat, about the relative merits of plant versus animal food. They are arguing, without always knowing it, about the aftermath of the megafauna extinction, about what happens to a body built for one nutritional world when that world disappears and something radically different takes its place. Think about what your great-great-grandparents ate, then their great-great-grandparents. Follow that line back far enough, and you arrive at a person standing on an open plain, watching a herd of horses move toward the horizon, understanding in their bones that the hunt tomorrow will be harder than the hunt today. Not because they wanted less, because the world that had fed their species for 2 million years was running out. They didn't stop eating meat because they evolved beyond it. They stopped, or reduced, or substituted, or scrambled to replace, because they had consumed their way through the animals that made it possible. And the diet that filled the gap, the grain and the legume and the cultivated tuber, fed more people and built more civilization than the hunt ever could have. But it built them in bodies that were asking, on some deep biological level, for something the new diet could not provide. The argument about what humans should eat is 400 years old in its modern form. In its actual form, it is 12,000 years old. It started the morning a hunter walked back into camp with less than the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that. And it has not been resolved yet, because the body that is asking the question is still the same body that learned to hunt mammoths. It is just eating wheat.